Okay, so previously we've reviewed scripts and we've had a brief introduction to functions, and so now it's time to convert a MATLAB script into a function. So firstly, to define a function, we need a definition, and we do this by using the keyword function and including this on the first line, so at the top of our file. Now we'll just take a quick look at the help documentation that MATLAB has on functions, sorry. So just typing help function, we can see that the help file for functions is brought up. As it says, new functions may be added to MATLAB's vocabulary. So in this help file, there's an example included here, which we can see includes the keyword function. Following this is the outputs, and they are defined in a set of square brackets. Now we can have as many or as few outputs as we'd like. Following the outputs is an equal sign. Following the equal sign is the function name, so in this case is stat, so that would be the function name for this example. And following that in curved brackets are the inputs to the function. And just like the number of outputs, the number of inputs can be as many or as few as we'd like. So just going back to our ForceCalc script, we want to convert this to a function. So for the moment, let's just write this function to have no outputs and no inputs, and then we'll slowly build on that. Okay, so to specify a function that does not have any outputs, we just include an empty set of square brackets, and then following this will be an equal sign, and then as we turn on the help file for functions, the function name, so let's just call it ForceCalc. And to specify that we don't want to have any inputs for our function, we just include an empty set of curved brackets. Now we'll go ahead and save this. Alright. So it's very important to note that the function name must be, the file name of our function must be identical to our function name. So we called our function ForceCalc, and so we're required to call our function name ForceCalc as well. Go ahead and save that. So just as an example, if I'm to cause a mismatch between our function name and our file name, so I'll just enter a random number here, we'll see that MATLAB gives us an error which says the function name and the file name for our function must be identical. Okay, so if we wish to call this function that we've just created in the command window, all we're required to do is enter the function's name, so ForceCalc, and we can see that we get our expected result. Okay, so we've called ForceCalc. All it does is enter the function and executes this code. So now that we've seen how we can call a function from the command window, let's now edit this function so that it takes inputs. So if we just comment out this mass variable here, we can include the mass variable as an input to our function. We'll still leave no output, and we'll add that later. So this code will still execute the same as it did before, except that the input, which is mass, will be prescribed by us, and so everywhere the input mass is used in this code, we'll use the value that we give the input to this function. Okay, so for example, calling this function again and including an input, say just a single value for now, we can see that we're still getting the desired output to the screen, so the desired display, expected results. However, since I just entered a single value, it's only outputting one force value to our screen. So this is expected, but the previous examples had mass defined as an array that included 5 elements, and so 5 messages were being displayed to the screen when this code was executed. So as I was saying, this code will still execute the same as it did before, except that the input will now be described by us. So just a quick note, adding on to what I said in the previous screencast, if we clear the MATLAB workspace as we've done now, and then call the function as we just did, since the function uses its own private workspace, its variables do not show up in this default MATLAB workspace, and so we're unable to change those or interfere with those. Okay, so we should note that whenever we call a function, we do not have to use the same input name as the one defined in our function file. So our input name defined in our function file is mass in this case, and if we want to go back to command window now, create a random variable, let's say m, we'll make it an array, give it a few values. If we now want to pass this into our force calc function as an input, we can. We can see it had 3 values, we're getting 3 displays, so we're getting expected results, and we also note that the value that we pass in as an input does not have to be the same as the name of the input variable that we've used in our function file. And so all that's happening is once a function is called, mass is taking the value of, in this case, m, and it is using it throughout the code included in that function file. Okay, so now we'll include an output in our function. So what would seem like a good output here? Let's say force. Alright, so we'll include force as an output to our function. So this code will still display these strings in the command, but now we're providing an input for this function, and then this function will then return an output. Okay, so running this function again, using the m variable that we created before, we can see that oh, sorry, I didn't save. That's why so if I just run this again, so calling our function, including the input as m as we defined before, we can see that we get the same string displays to the screen, but now we're also getting the default MATLAB output variable ANS. Alright, so as we haven't defined our own output variable, MATLAB has done it for us with ANS. So this ANS just holds the output values of force from our function, as we can see here. So if we wanted to store these values of force, all we have to do is define our own variable, let's say f, and then let this be equal to our function with our input m. Okay, so just running this, we can see that the values of force are now stored in f. Okay, so lastly, I should mention that the line under the function definition in a function file is called the h1 line. It is not compulsory. However, the h1 line however, the h1 line is displayed when we use the help feature on our function. So for example, if I just write something meaningful in here to do maybe a small description of our function. So we'll say force calc calculates the force due to gravity of masses defined in input mass. Now if I go back to my command window, just clear this, and then use the help feature for our force calc function that we've just created, we'll see that the h1 line is displayed. So force calc calculates the force due to gravity of masses defined in mass. Okay, so that's displayed, that comment that we've just entered. So it's also good to define the input and output parameters of the functions that we create. So just quickly doing that now, we can say for mass, which is our input, we'll say is an array of input mass parameters. And for our output force, we can say that it's an array of computed force values. I'm just saving that, going back to our command window and running help on our force calculation, on our force calc function. We can see the comments that we've just added have been included as help documentation for our function. So it's also good to add a description as well. But having another look, just one last look at our function that we've created, we can see that we've got our function definition, which goes at the top of our help file, where this is our function name, and our function name must be identical to our function's file name. We've got the h1 line, which is displayed as the help documentation for our function. We've got some comments, and then of course we've got our code that executes when the function is called.